Picture this. A forest so dark the horses can't see their own breath. Fog rolls between the pines like something alive, something hungry. Somewhere ahead, a branch snaps. Then another. Then the screaming starts. Men in turbans stumble through the blackness, armour clanging against tree trunks, swords swinging at shadows. The ground is mud and ice and something slicker. Blood, pooling faster than the frozen earth can drink it. A cavalry commander shouts for formation, but his voice drowns in the wet thud of arrows punching through leather, through flesh, through bone. The arrows come from everywhere, from nowhere, from the trees themselves. A janissary trips over a corpse and realises it's still warm, still twitching. He looks up and sees torchlight flickering between the pines. Not rescue, but hunters. Peasants with axes. Shepherds with clubs studded in iron nails. Women with hay forks stabbing at anything that moves and speaks Turkish. The smell hits before the next wave. Wood smoke and opened bowels. Copper tang blood freezing in the air. A horse screams somewhere to the left. A sound no animal should make, high and almost human. Then cuts off with a crunch that echoes. This is not a battle. This is a harvesting. The Ottoman column had marched into Moldova expecting peasants, expecting submission, expecting a minor campaign before spring planting, something to blood the new recruits and remind these Wallachian backwaters who rule the world. 120,000 men, the largest army the Sultan had sent north since Constantinople fell. They found the forest instead, and in the forest they found him. He watches from a ridge, wrapped in wolf fur, face lit by a single torch held by a boyar who knows better than to speak. His eyes track the slaughter below with the patience of a man watching wheat being threshed. No satisfaction, no horror, just calculation. Each scream is a number. Each burning wagon is an equation solved. His name is Stephen. His people call him Cel Mere, the Great. His enemies have other names for him, whispered in the tents of sultans, scratched into the margins of Ottoman field reports that no commander wants to sign. But here is what the legends never mention. He is 41 years old, and he has been fighting since he was 17. 24 years of war. 24 years of watching men die in forests just like this one. Some of them friends, most of them strangers, all of them bleeding the same colour into the same indifferent mud. Historians still debate whether the ambush at Vaslui was military genius, or simply the mathematics of desperation. A smaller army using terrain the way a drowning man uses driftwood. But the Ottomans who survived that night didn't debate anything. They simply refused to march north again while Stephen lived. Here is the question that haunts every chronicle written about this man. His cousin Vlad impaled 20,000 people and earned the name Dracula. He became the monster Europe couldn't forget. But the Ottoman Empire, the greatest military power on earth, didn't fear Vlad. They replaced him twice. They broke him. Stephen, they never broke. So what does a man become when he's too dangerous to destroy and too stubborn to die? What does victory cost when you've paid it 47 times and the bill keeps coming? How does a prince who started with nothing hold back an empire for 47 years? And what's left of him when the holding is done? The boy who would become Stephen the Great learned his first lesson at 7 years old. Family will kill you faster than enemies. He watched from behind a door, oak, iron-banded, cold against his cheek, as his father argued with men whose swords weren't sheathed. Bogdan II, voivode of Moldavia, had ruled for only 2 years, long enough to make promises, not long enough to keep them. The assassins were led by Bogdan's own brother. Stephen heard the first blow, a wet sound like an axe splitting green wood, then shouting, then the particular silence that follows when a man stops breathing and the killers realise what they've done cannot be undone. His older brother Petru grabbed him by the arm, pulled him through servants' passages that smelled of lye and old grease. They ran through courtyards where guards were already switching allegiances, past stables where grooms pretended not to see. By dawn, they were in the forest. By nightfall, they were orphans. The throne of Moldavia passed to the uncle who had ordered the killing, then to another uncle, then to a cousin. The succession became a butcher's rotation. each new voivode lasting only until the next knife found the right back. Stephen spent the next 12 years learning what exile teaches. Nothing is given, everything is taken, and the men who smile widest are measuring you for a grave. He lived first in Wallachia, at the court of a prince named Vlad. They were cousins, these two boys, sons of murdered fathers, inheritors of stolen thrones, raised on the same diet of paranoia and violence. But where Vlad's hatred burned hot and visible, Stephen's froze into something harder. He watched Vlad's rages, his elaborate punishments, his need to be feared. He learned what worked and what didn't. Terror, he concluded, was a tool, but tools wear out. Tools can be turned against the hand that wields them. Patience was something else entirely. At 17, Stephen crossed back into Moldavia with a borrowed army. 300 men, maybe fewer. The chronicles disagree. He had no money, no alliances, no claim that anyone powerful recognized. He had only the memory of his father's blood pooling on stone floors, and 12 years of calculating exactly how many throats needed cutting before the throne was his. The battle at Doljești lasted less than a day. Stephen's forces caught the ruling voivode's army stretched between two hills, cavalry scattered, infantry still forming lines. It should have been a slaughter against him. Instead, Stephen did something the chronicles note with surprise. He led the charge himself. Not from behind, not from a command position. He rode at the front, sword already bloody before his horse cleared the tree line. Historians still debate whether this was courage or calculation, whether the young exile genuinely didn't fear death, or whether he understood that men follow a prince who bleeds with them in ways they'll never follow one who watches from safety. Either way, it worked. By nightfall, he held the field. By the next morning, he held Suceava, the capital. By the end of the week, the boyars who had survived the succession wars bent their knees and called him voivode. He was 17 years old. He had already killed men with his own hands. He had already learned that thrones are rented, never owned, and the rent comes due in blood. But the throne was only the beginning of the problem. Moldavia in 1457 was not a kingdom. It was a wound. The succession wars had emptied the treasury, scattered the army, and turned the boyar class into a nest of vipers who measured loyalty in bribes. To the south, Wallachia was collapsing under Ottoman pressure. To the east, the Tatars raided at will, carrying off slaves and livestock. To the west, Hungary watched with the patient hunger of a larger predator. And to the south, beyond the Danube, the Ottoman Empire was just finishing its digestion of Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, fallen 4 years earlier to Sultan Mehmed II. The Conqueror, they called him. The man who ended the Roman Empire, the man who was now looking north. Stephen looked at his ruined treasury, his fractured army, his boyars with their poisoned smiles, and made a decision that would define the next 47 years. He would not run again. The year Stephen took his throne, his cousin Vlad was making corpses into furniture. 20,000 Ottoman prisoners, impaled on wooden stakes outside the walls of Târgoviște. The stakes had been carved with care, tapered, oiled, designed to enter the body and exit slowly, keeping victims alive for days. Some were positioned facing east toward Mecca. Others were arranged in geometric patterns, a forest of dying men that stretched for miles. When Sultan Mehmed II rode north to punish this upstart Wallachian prince, his army smelled the killing field before they saw it. Hardened janissaries, men who had watched Constantinople burn, vomited in their saddles. The Sultan himself, according to Ottoman chroniclers, turned his horse around and rode south without engaging. Vlad had won. Through pure theatrical horror, he had made the conqueror flinch. Stephen watched from across the border, and what he saw was not victory. He saw a man who had emptied every weapon in his arsenal at once. He saw a prince who had traded long-term survival for a single moment of shock. He saw a cousin who had forgotten that empires have patience, and patience always wins. The impalement worked once. It would not work twice. Within 2 years, Mehmed returned with a larger army and a simpler strategy. He didn't fight Vlad at all. He just paid Vlad's own boyars to betray him. The same nobles who had watched the impalements, who had cheered the Ottoman dead, opened their gates and let Turkish soldiers walk in. Vlad fled. He spent the next 12 years in a Hungarian prison, half guest and half captive, writing letters that no one answered. When he finally returned to Wallachia, he lasted 2 months before someone put a sword through his back. The impaler died impaled on his own legend, killed not by Ottomans but by the Wallachians who no longer trusted a man who made fear his only currency. Stephen learned 3 lessons from his cousin's fall. First, terror is a consumable resource. Each atrocity must exceed the last, or the audience grows numb. Eventually you run out of ways to shock, and then you've run out of everything. Second, boyars are not allies. They are employees who will renegotiate their contracts the moment a better offer arrives. The only way to keep them is to make betrayal more expensive than loyalty. Third, the Ottomans don't need to kill you. They only need to wait until your own people do it for them. So Stephen built differently. Where Vlad impaled, Stephen executed, but quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. Traitors died in dungeons, not on public stakes. Their families were absorbed into the state, their lands redistributed to loyal men, their names erased from chronicles. No martyrs, no legends, just disappearances that everyone understood but no one discussed. Where Vlad alienated his boyars, Stephen bound them with grants, marriages, and carefully calibrated fear. He knew which families could be trusted, which needed watching, which had to be pruned. He attended their weddings. He stood godfather to their children, and when necessary he reminded them that godfather was not the same as friend. Where Vlad fought the Ottomans openly, Stephen prepared for a war that might never come, and made sure that if it came, it would cost more than any sultan wanted to pay. Historians still debate whether Stephen was genuinely more merciful than Vlad, or simply better at hiding the bodies. The chronicles describe a man who prayed daily, endowed monasteries, and wept at the deaths of his soldiers. They also describe a man who blinded rebellious boyars, who burned villages that collaborated with enemies, who worked prisoners to death in his stone quarries without apparent hesitation. Perhaps there was no contradiction. Perhaps he understood what his cousin never did, that cruelty must be purposeful, measured, invisible, a tool kept sharp by being used rarely. The stake and the dungeon achieve the same result. Only one of them turns your own people against you. By 1462, Vlad was running and Stephen was building. Fortress by fortress, alliance by alliance, he was constructing something his cousin never had, a state that could outlast its prince. But empires notice when smaller men stop bowing, and Mehmed the Conqueror had a long memory. The first time Stephen killed Ottomans, he wasn't even supposed to be fighting them. The target was Shilia, a fortress city on the Danube Delta where the river met the Black Sea. Whoever held Shilia controlled the grain trade, the fish trade, the slave trade, every transaction that moved between Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Mediterranean. The fortress had been Moldavian once, before Stephen's predecessors sold it to pay for wars they lost anyway. In 1465, Stephen decided it was time to collect what his family had squandered. The garrison was Wallachian, technically allied with the Ottomans but not yet Turkish. Stephen brought 8,000 men through winter marshes, moving by night, sleeping in boats hidden among the reeds. His soldiers wrapped their weapons in cloth to prevent clanking. They slaughtered their extra horses rather than let them whinny and give away positions. The assault came at dawn on a day so cold the Danube had frozen near the banks. Stephen's men crossed the ice on foot, ladders on their backs, breath crystallizing into clouds that hung in the still air. The first guard died with a hand axe in his throat, too surprised to scream. The second died reaching for a warning bell he never touched. By noon, Stephen stood in the citadel's great hall, blood freezing on his armour, surrounded by the bodies of men who had woken up expecting an ordinary day. But Shilia's fall was only the opening move. 3 months later, he took Cetatea Alba, the White Fortress, jewel of the Black Sea coast, the largest port between Constantinople and the Crimea. This time, the garrison was partially Ottoman. This time, there would be consequences. Stephen didn't care. The assault cost him 2,000 men, a price that would have bankrupted lesser princes. He paid it without flinching. When the walls finally broke, his soldiers poured through with a fury that shocked even the hardened Crimean merchants who had seen every kind of warfare. According to witnesses, Stephen walked through the captured city as the looting continued around him. He stepped over bodies. He ignored the screaming from houses where his men were taking payment in the oldest currency. He was looking for something. He found it in the treasury, Ottoman seals, treaties, letters from the Sultan's court promising protection to any port that bent its knee. Stephen burned them in the public square. He made sure the smoke was visible from the sea, where Ottoman trading vessels would be watching. The message was clear. This coast no longer belonged to Constantinople. Historians still debate whether Stephen understood the magnitude of what he had done, or whether youthful arrogance blinded him to the inevitable response. The Black Sea was not a Moldavian pond. It was an Ottoman lake, and the Sultan who had conquered Constantinople did not tolerate insults from provincial nobodies. But Stephen had calculated something that his predecessors never understood. Mehmed was busy. The Conqueror was fighting in Albania, in Greece, in the Aegean. His armies were stretched across 3 continents. A minor Moldavian raid, however irritating, wasn't worth a major campaign, not yet. So Stephen used the time. He fortified Chilia with walls twice as thick as the originals. He dredged Cetatea Alba's harbour to accommodate larger warships. He imposed taxes on every bale of grain, every barrel of fish, every slave coffle that moved through his ports, and used the money to hire mercenaries, buy cannon, stockpile the saltpeter and sulphur that would make Ottoman sieges expensive. The boyars grumbled. Port taxes hurt their trade margins. Fortress construction required peasant labour that could have been working their estates. Several suggested delicately that perhaps the voivode might consider making peace with the Sultan. Perhaps some accommodation could be reached. Perhaps tribute ... Stephen listened. He nodded. He made notes of names. A week later, 3 boyar families discovered that their lands had been confiscated for tax irregularities. The heads of those families were invited to Suceava for discussions that never ended. Their sons were given the choice between monasteries and unmarked graves. The grumbling stopped. By 1470, Stephen controlled the most profitable ports on the Black Sea's western coast. He had an army of 40,000 men, mixed between peasant levies and professional cavalry. He had a treasury that, for the first time in Moldavian history, actually contained money. And he had Mehmed's attention. The Sultan sent a messenger with simple terms: return the ports, pay tribute, and Moldavia would be allowed to continue existing. Stephen sent the messenger back without his ears. Stone doesn't betray. Stephen learned this from watching Vlad fall, not to Ottoman swords, but to boyar treachery. Walls can't be bribed. Towers don't renegotiate their loyalty when a larger army appears on the horizon. So, while his nobles built pleasure houses and imported tapestries, Stephen built fortresses. Suceava, the capital, received walls 12 feet thick at the base, tapering to 8 feet at the crenellations. The stones came from quarries 100 miles distant, dragged by oxen through mountain passes, shaped by masons Stephen had imported from Hungary at salaries that made his treasurer physically ill. Each block was fitted without mortar at the joins, interlocking teeth of granite that would flex during earthquakes and cannon bombardment without crumbling. Nymph's fortress rose next, clinging to a cliff face like something grown rather than built. The approach road was deliberately left as a narrow switchback where cavalry couldn't charge, and supply wagons would take hours to climb. At the top, cisterns cut into living rock could hold enough water for 1,000 men to survive a year-long siege. Then Hotin, then Soroka, then Orhei, Cetatea Neamț, Roman, each positioned a day's march from the next, forming a web of stone across the principality. The boyars watched the treasury drain and whispered that their voivode had gone mad. Peasants conscripted for construction labour whispered darker things, that Stephen was building tombs, not fortresses, monuments to a paranoia that saw Ottoman armies behind every tree. Stephen heard the whispers. He ignored them. What his critics didn't understand, what they couldn't understand because they thought in seasons rather than decades, was that Stephen wasn't building defences. He was building a strategy. No fortress alone could stop the Ottoman army. Mehmed had taken Constantinople, the most fortified city in human history. He had cannons that could crack walls which had stood for 1,000 years. A single siege, pressed with determination, would eventually break any Moldavian fortress. But breaking one fortress meant ignoring the others, and while the Sultan's army sat before Suceava, burning powder and losing men to disease and cold, raiding parties from Nems would cut their supply lines. Cavalry from Hotin would intercept reinforcements. Peasant irregulars, operating from forests the Ottomans couldn't penetrate, would make foraging expeditions into funerals. The fortresses weren't walls. They were anchors for a fleet of harassment, bases from which Moldova could bleed an invader dry without ever offering the decisive battle that Ottoman superiority would win. Historians still debate whether Stephen designed this strategy consciously or stumbled into it through the practical necessities of his geography. The chronicles don't record his planning sessions, only their results. But the pattern is too consistent for accident. Each fortress covered the weakness of the next. Each was positioned to control a river crossing, a mountain pass, a forest approach. Together, they transformed Moldova from an open plain into a labyrinth with teeth. And there was one more element, the cruelest part of the design. Stephen knew he couldn't protect his people. A fortress that shelters civilians is a fortress that runs out of food. A garrison burdened with refugees is a garrison that can't sortie. So the peasants would not be saved. They would be sacrificed. When the Ottomans came, and Stephen never doubted they would come, the villages would burn. The crops would be razed. The wells would be poisoned with rotting carcasses. The population would flee into the forests or die in the fields, and the invading army would find nothing to eat, nothing to drink, nothing to loot except ashes and corpses. The fortresses would hold. The land would become a weapon. Stephen never explained this calculus to his people. He let them believe the walls were built for their protection. He accepted their gratitude for fortifications that would watch them die from a safe distance. Perhaps he told himself it was necessary. Perhaps he believed that survival required sacrifice, and that a prince who couldn't order sacrifices wasn't fit to rule. Perhaps after 12 years of exile and a lifetime of watching family murder family, he had simply stopped seeing peasants as anything but numbers, resources to be spent, like cavalry horses or artillery powder. The truth is probably simpler. He built what would work. Whether it was moral was a question for men who had the luxury of choosing morality. By 1474, the system was complete. 16 fortresses, 40,000 men under arms, a treasury still strained but no longer empty, and a population that had no idea what was about to be demanded of them. Across the Danube, Mehmed was finishing his war in Albania. His generals were already drafting orders for the northern campaign. The Conqueror's patience had run out. The letter arrived in Suceava on a September morning when the leaves were just beginning to turn. An Ottoman courier, dressed in silks that cost more than a Moldavian village, presented it with the elaborate courtesies that Constantinople used to mask threats as diplomacy. The Sultan, light of the world, shadow of God on earth, extended his greetings to the voivode of Moldavia. The Sultan noted with regret that certain misunderstandings had occurred regarding port cities that rightfully belonged under Ottoman protection. The Sultan observed that tribute owed had not been paid for several years. The Sultan suggested that these matters might be resolved through submission or through consequences. The consequences were not specified. They didn't need to be. Stephen read the letter twice. He noted the quality of the paper, Egyptian, expensive. He noted the calligraphy, a master's hand, not a secretary's. He noted the seal, Mehmed's personal signet, not the chancery stamp. The Conqueror himself had dictated these words. Stephen dismissed the courier with gifts and empty promises of consideration. Then he called his council and told them what they already knew. The war was coming, and it was coming soon. The boyars argued for tribute. Moldavia could not defeat the Ottoman Empire. This was elementary mathematics, not cowardice. Better to pay gold than blood. Better to bend than break. Wallachia paid tribute. Serbia paid tribute. Bosnia had paid tribute until it stopped paying anything at all, and now Bosnia was a memory. Stephen listened. He waited until the last voice fell silent. Then he asked a simple question. When does tribute end? No one answered. Tribute didn't end. That was the point of tribute. You paid it until you couldn't pay anymore, and then you paid it with land, with soldiers, with your sons sent to Constantinople as hostages, with your daughters sent to harems. You paid until there was nothing left to pay with except your throne, and then you paid that too. Stephen understood something his boyars didn't, or pretended not to understand because the truth was unbearable. Submission was not survival. It was slow death. A generation, maybe two, and Moldavia would be absorbed like every other Christian territory that had tried to buy peace with gold. The only question was whether to die fighting or die kneeling. He chose fighting. Historians still debate whether this was courage or madness, whether Stephen genuinely believed he could defeat the Ottomans, or whether he simply preferred a dramatic end to a gradual dissolution. The chronicles record his speeches about freedom and faith, his invocations of St. George and the Holy Virgin. They don't record his private calculations, the sleepless nights, the cold assessment of odds that must have shown him exactly how unlikely survival was. But Stephen had one advantage Mehmed didn't expect. He knew what was coming, and Mehmed didn't know that he knew. The Sultan had assembled an army in secret, or what passed for secret when you were moving 120,000 men across half a continent. Stephen's spies in Constantinople, bought with Black Sea port money, reported every detail: the troop levies, the artillery trains, the supply boats being built along the Danube, the Janissary regiments being pulled from the Albanian front. This wasn't a punitive raid. This was an army of conquest, the same size as the force that had taken Constantinople. Mehmed intended to erase Moldavia entirely. Stephen used the winter to prepare. He called up every able-bodied man between 15 and 60, not a levy, but a mobilization, the entire military potential of his principality. Peasants who had never held swords were handed spears and given 2 months of drilling. Boyar cavalry, who usually fought in ceremonial armour, were issued practical kit and told to practice night operations. The fortresses were stocked with a year's provisions. Evacuation routes were mapped from every major village into the forest depths where cavalry couldn't follow. Orders went out to the peasant elders. When the Ottomans came, burn everything, poison the wells, drive the livestock into the mountains, leave nothing behind but scorched earth and ashes. And Stephen sent letters of his own to Hungary, to Poland, to the Pope, to Venice, to every Christian power that had ever promised crusade against the Turk. He described the Ottoman army massing on the Danube. He described what Mehmed intended. He asked, begged, though his words never stooped to begging for assistance. The replies came back slowly. Hungary offered prayers, Poland offered sympathies. The Pope offered indulgences for any who died fighting the infidel. Venice offered trade agreements for after the war. No one offered soldiers. Stephen read the letters and burned them. He had expected nothing else. When you are small, you fight alone. In January 1475, the Ottoman army crossed the Danube. The Ottoman army was so large it took 3 days to cross the Danube at Oblustitsa. 120,000 men, some chronicles say more, stretching in columns that blackened roads for miles. Sipahi cavalry in armour that gleamed like water. Janissary infantry marching in perfect formation, their discipline the envy of every army in Christendom. Artillery trains dragging siege cannons that had cracked the walls of Constantinople, and at their head, Suleiman Pasha, the Sultan's most trusted general, a man who had never lost a major battle. They expected to reach Suceava in 2 weeks. They expected resistance to crumble the moment peasant levies saw professional soldiers. They expected Stephen to run, to negotiate, to do what every other Balkan prince had done when faced with overwhelming force. They did not expect the mud. January in Moldavia is not like January in Constantinople. The rivers don't freeze solid. They half-freeze, creating a slush of ice and water that horses can't cross and wagons can't navigate. The ground becomes a mixture of snow, mud, and frozen ruts that breaks ankles and shatters wagon wheels. The fog rolls in so thick that a man can lose his unit within 50 paces. And the forests. The forests are something else entirely. Stephen had chosen his ground months in advance. The valley of the Balad River, near a village called Vaslui. The approaches were narrow, choked with forest that prevented the Ottomans from deploying their superior numbers. The ground was marshy even in winter, treacherous for cavalry, and the fog came every morning like a gift from God, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Suleiman's scouts reported the terrain. They recommended waiting for spring, when the ground would harden and the fog would lift. Suleiman ignored them. The Sultan wanted results. The army pressed forward. On January 10th, 1475, they entered the killing ground. Stephen had positioned his army in 3 divisions. The centre, mostly peasant infantry with pikes and axes, was deliberately weak, designed to bend and draw the Ottomans in. The flanks were hidden in the forest. His best cavalry, his mercenary crossbowmen, his boyars in full armour waiting in absolute silence. The fog that morning was so thick that the Ottomans didn't see the Moldavian centre until they were almost on top of it. Stephen had ordered no drums, no trumpets, no sound at all until contact. The first warning was arrows dropping from the grey sky, cloth-wrapped shafts that whispered rather than whistled. The Sipahi vanguard charged, confident they would shatter the peasant line. They hit the pikes instead. A wall of sharpened ash poles braced against the frozen ground. Horses screamed and went down, crushing their riders. The men behind couldn't stop, couldn't see, couldn't understand what was happening in the fog. They rode into their own fallen comrades and added to the chaos. Then Stephen sprung the flanks. The Moldavian cavalry burst from the tree line with a sound like thunder. Thousands of hooves striking frozen ground, voices raised not in battle cries, but in a sustained, wordless roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the fog, the Ottomans couldn't tell where the attack was coming from. Some units turned to face the left flank and exposed their backs to the right. Others tried to retreat and ran into columns still pressing forward. The battle became a slaughter. Historians still debate whether the casualty figures were exaggerated by later chroniclers, eager to celebrate Stephen's victory. The lowest estimates put Ottoman dead at 40,000. The highest say the number approached 90,000, with another 20,000 captured. The slaughter lasted 4 hours. Stephen rode through the carnage as it happened, issuing orders, redirecting units, plugging gaps in the line where Ottoman pockets broke through. An arrow struck his armour and glanced off. A Sipahi got close enough to swing a sword. Stephen killed him personally, adding 1 more body to the count. By noon, it was over. The survivors fled south in disorder, abandoning their supplies, their artillery, their wounded. Suleiman Pasha barely escaped, his bodyguard forming a desperate rearguard that died to the last man buying him time. The valley of Vaslui was carpeted with dead. Peasants would find bones in those fields for the next century, skulls with Turkish helmet dents, rib cages with arrowheads still lodged between the bones, mass graves that rain would periodically expose. Stephen ordered Te Deum sung over the battlefield. He made his surviving soldiers kneel in the blood-soaked mud and thank God for victory. Then he sat down in his command tent and wrote letters to every court in Europe. "We have defeated the enemies of Christendom," he declared, "but they will return. In the name of God, send help." The letters went out. Stephen waited. No help came. The courts of Europe celebrated Stephen's triumph like it was their own. Pope Sixtus IV declared him Athleta Christi, champion of Christ, and ordered prayers of thanksgiving in every cathedral. The Venetian Senate voted him honorary citizenship and a pension he would never collect. Hungarian chroniclers compared him to Joshua and Judas Maccabeus, warriors of God who had thrown back pagan invasions. Letters of congratulation piled up in Suceava, gold-embossed parchments, elaborate seals, poetic praise in Latin, Italian, German. Not a single soldier. Stephen read the letters and understood exactly what they meant. Europe was delighted that someone else was bleeding for Christendom. Europe was thrilled that Moldavian peasants were dying so that Polish and Hungarian and Italian peasants wouldn't have to. Europe would pray for Stephen, celebrate Stephen, immortalise Stephen, and leave Stephen to face the next invasion alone. The mathematics hadn't changed. His army at Vaslui had numbered perhaps 40,000 men. He had lost 10,000, killed, wounded, disabled. Another 5,000 had deserted in the aftermath, peasants who had seen enough blood to last a lifetime. That left 25,000 to face whatever Mehmed sent next, and Mehmed would send something next. The Conqueror did not accept defeat. The Conqueror had lost armies before, in Albania, in Hungary, in a dozen forgotten campaigns, and he had always returned with larger armies, better generals, more relentless pressure. The Ottoman Empire could absorb losses that would bankrupt smaller states. Constantinople's treasury held the wealth of 3 continents. Its population provided a functionally inexhaustible supply of soldiers. Stephen had won a battle, he had not won a war. The months after Vaslui became a desperate scramble for resources. Stephen stripped his treasury to rebuild the army. He raised taxes until peasants were giving 3/4 of their harvest to military funds. He sent envoys to Poland, to Hungary, to anyone who might provide even a token force, something to prove that Moldavia wasn't entirely alone. Hungary finally offered terms. King Matthias Corvinus would send troops if Stephen acknowledged Hungarian suzerainty and accepted a Hungarian garrison in Suceava. The price of help was sovereignty. Stephen refused. Historians still debate whether this was pride or principle, whether he couldn't accept foreign masters, or whether he calculated, correctly, that Hungarian protection would mean Hungarian annexation within a generation. But the refusal left him where he had always been, alone. The diplomatic situation was worse than the military one. Wallachia, his neighbour to the south, had returned to Ottoman vassalage after Vlad's fall. The new voivode was a Turkish puppet, and Stephen's spies reported that Wallachian nobles were already negotiating with Constantinople, offering to provide guides, supplies, intelligence for the next invasion. The Tatars to the east smelled blood. Crimean raiders had stayed neutral during Vaslui, watching to see which side would win. Now they were making their own calculations, and those calculations did not favour Stephen. Even his boyars were wavering. The great families had celebrated victory in January. By summer they were counting the cost, the emptied granaries, the conscripted sons, the trade routes closed by Ottoman blockade. Several quietly reached out to Constantinople, exploring what terms might be available for accommodation. Stephen knew. He always knew. His intelligence network had been built over 2 decades of paranoid attention to detail. Every boyar family had at least one servant on Stephen's payroll. Every monastery had a monk who reported to Suceava. He made lists. He noted names. He took no immediate action. There would be time for purges later, if there was a later. In December 1475, the news arrived. Mehmed had finished preparations. An army of 150,000 men was assembling at Adrianople. This time, the Sultan would lead personally. The Conqueror was coming. Stephen ordered his commanders to report. The numbers were not encouraging. 35,000 men, including the garrisons, he would have to strip from the fortresses. Half of them were peasant levies with minimal training. The cavalry was capable but exhausted, many units still recovering from Vaslui losses. He was outnumbered 4-1, and this time there would be no fog. Mehmed would not be led into valleys where his numbers couldn't deploy. The Conqueror learned from defeat. He would bring engineers to clear forest, pioneers to corduroy roads, screens of light cavalry to prevent ambush. Stephen's strategy, the strategy of terrain and harassment, would still work, but it would cost more. The fortresses would hold, but the land outside would burn. The people outside would die. The voivode made his preparations. He did not pray for help anymore. The Conqueror crossed the Danube in June 1476 with an army that defied comprehension. 150,000 soldiers, according to the lowest Ottoman estimates. Some Christian sources claimed 300,000, an exaggeration, but the exaggeration itself testified to the psychological impact. Supply trains stretched for 60 miles. The artillery park included the great bombards that had shattered Constantinople's walls, each cannon requiring 40 oxen to drag. Engineers carried prefabricated bridges that could span any river in Moldova. and at the centre of this locust swarm rode Mehmed II himself, 54 years old, heavy with decades of conquest, his armour worth more than most Moldavian villages would produce in a generation. He was coming to finish what Suleiman Pasha had failed to do. He was coming to erase Stephen's name from history. Stephen knew he could not stop this army. He had known it for months, had made his preparations accordingly. The night before Mehmed crossed the Danube, orders went out to every village in southern Moldavia. Burn everything. The peasants obeyed. They had no choice, Stephen's officers made sure of that. But some of them obeyed willingly, grimly, understanding what was being asked and why. The smoke rose for days. Granaries that families had filled through years of careful husbandry became ash. Houses that had sheltered generations became blackened foundations. Livestock that couldn't be driven north was slaughtered and left to rot in poisoned wells. Beehives were smashed. Orchting trees were girdled. The Moldavians destroyed their own country with a thoroughness that would have impressed the Mongols. Mehmed's army advanced into a wasteland. The first Ottoman foraging parties found nothing. Not a chicken, not a sack of grain, not a well that could be drunk from. They returned empty-handed, then stopped returning entirely. Moldavian light cavalry, mounted on horses that knew the terrain, picked off stragglers with arrows and vanished before pursuit could organise. The Sultan pressed forward. He had no choice. His army consumed supplies faster than the trains could bring them. Every day of delay meant more horses dying, more men going on half rations, more dysentery spreading through camps that had to drink whatever foul water could be found. The fortresses Stephen had built proved their worth. Ottoman siege engineers approached Suceava's walls and found them thicker than expected, supplied by underground cisterns, defended by garrisons that had been preparing for years. Mehmed didn't have time for a siege. His army was starving. Historians still debate whether Mehmed intended to bring Stephen to pitched battle, or simply break enough of his fortresses to force submission. The surviving Ottoman sources are unclear, but circumstance forced a confrontation. At Valea Alba, the White Valley, Stephen's main army finally stood to fight. The battle was nothing like Vaslui. No fog, no ambush, just two armies facing each other across an open field, one 4 times the size of the other. Stephen knew he would lose. He told his commanders as much. The goal was not victory but cost, to kill enough Ottomans that Mehmed would question whether Moldova was worth the price. The Moldavians charged first, peasant infantry rushing forward with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant their families would be next. The Janissaries met them with disciplined volleys, arrows falling like rain, but the charge had momentum and the first line hit the Ottoman centre with a crash that echoed off the surrounding hills. For 3 hours Stephen's army held. His cavalry flanks swept again and again into the Ottoman horse, disrupting formations, buying time. His own guard fought around his banner, visible across the field, a rallying point when units wavered. But numbers tell. They always tell. The Ottoman right wing finally broke through, fresh reserves rolling over exhausted Moldavian levies. The centre buckled. Stephen ordered retreat before the army could be surrounded, a fighting withdrawal, his best cavalry covering the infantry as they fell back toward the forest. He lost 12,000 men at Valea Alba, maybe more, but Mehmed lost too. Ottoman sources admit to thousands dead, some say tens of thousands, though the numbers are unreliable. What is reliable is what happened next. Mehmed looked at his starving army, his overstretched supply lines, his cannons stuck in mud miles behind the front. He looked at the fortresses still holding, the forests still crawling with raiders, the peasantry that had left him nothing to conquer. And the Conqueror turned south. He burned what he could on the way out. He claimed victory in his dispatches to Constantinople, but he left without taking Suceava. He left without capturing Stephen. He left with his army diminished and his reputation for the first time in question. Stephen watched the Ottoman columns retreat from a ridge above the river. He had lost the battle. He had not lost his throne. Stephen walked the fields where his villagers used to stand and saw nothing but ash. The orders had been his. The destruction had been necessary. The calculation was simple. Deny the Ottomans resources and they retreat. let them forage, and they conquer. He had chosen the lesser evil, as he always chose the lesser evil, as he had been choosing lesser evil since he was 17 years old. But lesser evil was still evil. The smoke had cleared by August, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the end of the world. Farmsteads reduced to foundation stones, orchards cut down to stumps, wells filled with rotting animals, poisoning water tables that would take years to recover. Families that had farmed the same land for generations now wandered the forests, eating bark and roots, dying quietly where no one could record their names. Stephen organised relief, grain from northern districts that hadn't been touched, seeds for replanting, oxen to replace the slaughtered herds. It wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. Not after burning a quarter of the principality, but he gave what he could. And then he rode through the ruined south, showing himself to his people. Historians still debate whether this was genuine compassion or political calculation, whether Stephen actually cared about the peasants he had sacrificed, or whether he was simply maintaining the loyalty he would need for the next war. Perhaps both. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter when you're the man making decisions that kill thousands either way. The survivors didn't hate him. That was the strangest part. They understood, or said they understood. The Turks would have been worse. The Turks would have enslaved their children, burned their churches, made them forget the language of their fathers. At least Stephen was one of them. At least Stephen fought. But something had changed in the way they looked at him. He was no longer just their prince. He was the man who had burned their homes to save their souls. He was the face of a sacrifice they hadn't chosen, but couldn't refuse. The fortresses had held, every single one. Mehmed's siege engineers had approached Suceava, had set up their great bombards, had fired ranging shots against walls that simply absorbed the impact. After 3 days of bombardment, 3 days of consuming powder and shot that couldn't be resupplied, they had packed up and marched south without making a breach. Stephen's strategy had worked exactly as designed. The network of stone had anchored the defence. The scorched earth had starved the invaders. The harassment from the forests had bled them dry. Against the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever sent north, Moldova had survived. The cost was visible everywhere. 30,000 Moldavians dead. Soldiers, civilians. The distinction blurred into irrelevance when everyone was fighting. Half the farmland in the southern districts destroyed. A generation of young men buried in mass graves or missing entirely, their bodies left in forests where wolves found them first. And the threat had not ended. Mehmed had retreated, but Mehmed was still alive, still ruling, still commanding resources that dwarfed anything Stephen could mobilise. The Ottomans would return. They always returned. Stephen spent the winter rebuilding what he could and preparing for what he couldn't prevent. Letters went out again, to Poland, to Hungary, to Rome. The same appeals he had sent before Vaslui, before Valea Alba. Christendom must unite. The Turkish threat menaces all. Help us now, or face them alone later. The replies were familiar. Prayers, sympathy, praise for Stephen's courage. No soldiers. Poland was willing to negotiate an alliance but wanted territorial concessions. Stephen refused. He had not burned his own country to hand pieces of it away in peacetime. Hungary sent envoys who made grand promises and delivered nothing. Venice was more interested in its trading privileges with Constantinople than in any crusade. Europe had learned a comforting lesson from Stephen's victories. Moldova could hold the Ottomans alone. The Principality was a buffer, a sacrifice zone, a place where Christian blood could be spilled so that Polish and Hungarian blood didn't have to be. As long as Stephen kept fighting, everyone else could keep watching. He understood this. He had always understood it. But understanding didn't make the loneliness easier. His first wife had died years earlier. His children were scattered, some in his court, learning the brutal education of princes, others sent to foreign courts as hostages or marriage pawns. The boyars who surrounded him were loyal enough, but loyalty bought with fear is not the same as loyalty earned with love. Stephen was 43 years old. He had been fighting for 26 years. He had won every significant battle he had ever commanded. and he was more alone than he had been the night he fled his father's murder. The voivode stood on the walls of Suceava, watching the first snow fall on the ashes of his country, and considered what victory meant. It meant doing this again, and again, until he died, or the Ottomans stopped coming. Neither outcome seemed likely soon. The years after Mehmed's retreat blurred into a grey procession of smaller victories, smaller disasters, smaller betrayals. Mehmed the Conqueror died in 1481. Poison, some whispered, though the official cause was dysentery. Stephen received the news without visible reaction. He had outlasted the man who had conquered Constantinople, the man who had sent 2 armies to destroy him. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like a brief pause in an endless war. Mehmed's successor, Bayezid II, was more cautious than his father, but no less ambitious. The Ottoman Empire continued to probe Moldavia's borders, raiding parties, diplomatic pressure, support for rival claimants to Stephen's throne. The threat hadn't ended. It had simply become chronic, and Stephen was getting old. 47 battles the chronicles would eventually record. 47 engagements where Stephen had commanded personally, from desperate skirmishes against Tatar raiders to the great set pieces of Vaslui and Valea Alba. 47 times he had gambled his life and his throne on the outcome of a single day. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. His left arm ached in cold weather, legacy of a sword blow at Bayer that had cracked bone and never healed properly. His back seized up after long rides, forcing him to dismount and walk when the pain became unbearable. Some mornings, he woke with his vision blurred, the edges of his world soft and uncertain. The voivode who had led cavalry charges was becoming an old man who reviewed formations from horseback and let younger commanders do the killing. Historians still debate whether Stephen's later campaigns showed declining tactical brilliance or simply declining aggression, whether he had genuinely lost his edge, or whether he had finally learned that not every battle needed to be fought. The chronicles record victories, but smaller ones against weaker opponents. The great Ottoman armies didn't return in his lifetime. Perhaps his reputation was enough. Perhaps the empire had simply found easier targets, but the internal politics grew harder. The boyars who had feared Stephen in his prime sensed weakness in his age. Factions formed around his sons, jockeying for position, preparing for the succession struggle that everyone knew was coming. Stephen watched the manoeuvring with eyes that had seen this pattern before, in his father's court, in his uncle's court, in every court where power resided in mortal flesh. He purged when he had to. A minor noble who had corresponded with Constantinople disappeared into a monastery from which he never emerged. A boyar family that had accumulated too much land found their holdings confiscated for technical violations of feudal obligations. The dungeons beneath Suceava still received their occasional residents. But Stephen was tired. The paranoia that had kept him alive for decades now felt more like habit than necessity. He went to confession more frequently. He endowed more monasteries. The monasteries of Moldavia, Putna, Voronezh, Neamts, rose stone by stone, their frescoes depicting saints and battles, their walls housing the bones of men Stephen had killed, and the prayers of men who asked God to forgive him. His last wife, Maria of Mangup, watched him fade and left no recorded complaint. She had married a legend. She would bury a man. The difference was something wives learned to accept. The final Ottoman campaign came in 1497, when Stephen was 64 years old. Bayezid sent an army to test Moldavia's defences. Not a conquest force, but a probe, feeling for weakness. The army was smaller than those Mehmed had launched, perhaps 40,000 men, relying on speed rather than overwhelming numbers. Stephen met them at Codri Cosminuli with an army of his own. He couldn't ride at the front anymore. His officers placed him in a command position behind the lines, surrounded by guards who had orders to protect him even against his own instincts. He gave the orders. Younger men carried them out. The battle was a victory. The Ottomans were routed, their commander killed, their supply train captured. But watching the slaughter from a distance felt nothing like riding through it had felt 30 years before. He was winning through reputation now, through the fear that his name still commanded, through the machine he had built rather than the strength he no longer possessed. That night, after the victory feast he barely touched, Stephen walked alone to the monastery at Putna. He stood before the tomb he had commissioned for himself, marble, inscribed with his titles, waiting, and considered what it meant to have won. 47 battles, 47 years, a kingdom still standing against the largest empire on earth. And he was so tired. The chronicles don't record what he prayed that night. They record only that he stayed until dawn, and that his guards found him asleep on the stone floor, curled against the cold like a child. Stephen the Great died on July 2nd, 1504, in the bedchamber of his fortress at Suceava. He was 70 years old. The illness that killed him had been eating at his body for months. Gout, some sources say, or perhaps the cancerous rot that claims men who have spent too many decades in cold armour on wet fields. His legs had swollen until walking was impossible. The last weeks he could not rise from bed. The smell in the death chamber was sweet and rotten, the particular perfume of flesh decomposing before the spirit has fully departed. Monks circled the bed, chanting prayers for the dying. His sons waited in the antechamber already calculating. Stephen drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments he gave final instructions. Care for the army, maintain the fortresses, trust no one who promised friendship without first demonstrating it through sacrifice. His voice was a whisper. The secretaries leaned close to catch words that would become his testament. Historians still debate whether his final advice to his successor was genuine strategic wisdom or the desperate rambling of a dying man. The chronicles record that he told his son Bogdan to make peace with the Ottomans if war became impossible, to save the people even at the cost of pride. It sounded like surrender, the last words of a man who had spent 47 years refusing to surrender. Perhaps it was realism. Perhaps he finally understood what he had always known, that small states survive by bending, not breaking. That his lifetime of resistance had been an aberration, a miracle that could not be repeated. That the burden he had carried was too heavy for any one man, and the next voivode would have to find a different way. Or perhaps he was simply too tired to care anymore. He died in the early morning, when the summer light was just beginning to filter through the narrow windows. The monks recorded the exact moment, the 3rd hour after midnight. They crossed his arms over his chest and closed his eyes and began the prayers for the dead. The news spread slowly through Moldavia, village to village, fortress to fortress. In some places there was genuine grief. Peasants who remembered that Stephen had burned their homes remembered also that he had done it to save them from worse. They wept for the only prince who had ever fought for them. In other places the reaction was more practical. Boyars who had been waiting for this moment began moving their pieces. Messengers rode for Constantinople, for Krakow, for Buda, carrying proposals and promises. The succession struggle Stephen had delayed through sheer longevity was finally beginning. His son Bogdan took the throne without serious challenge. Stephen had been careful about that, eliminating potential rivals over decades of patient work. But Bogdan was not Stephen. He lacked the tactical brilliance, the stubborn endurance, the bottomless well of violence and cunning that had kept Moldova independent. Within a generation, Moldavia would become an Ottoman vassal state. The fortresses Stephen built still stood. The army he had trained still marched. The system he had created still functioned. But the will that had animated it all, the ruthless intelligence that had turned a poor principality into an empire's nightmare, that could not be inherited. The Ottoman Empire absorbed Moldavia the way it absorbed everything else, gradually, patiently, through diplomacy and pressure and the occasional demonstration of overwhelming force. By 1538, the principality was paying tribute to Constantinople. By 1600, it was effectively a province. Everything Stephen had fought for came undone within the span of a lifetime, and yet, the Ottomans never forgot him. Long after Vlad Dracula had become a legend of horror, a monster figure useful for frightening children and titillating Western audiences, Stephen remained something else in Ottoman memory. He was the one who had stopped the Conqueror, the one who had proven that Mehmed's armies were not invincible, the one who had shown for 47 years that will and terrain and strategic patience could hold back the tide. They built no statues to him in Constantinople. They wrote no epic poems. But in the military colleges where Ottoman officers studied their history, Stephen's campaigns were analysed for generations. The ambush at Vaslui was studied as a masterpiece of terrain exploitation. The scorched earth defence against Mehmed was studied as a model of asymmetric warfare. He had become, in Ottoman eyes, the most dangerous kind of enemy. Not a monster to be feared, but a professional to be respected. Not a Dracula, with his theatrical impalement and his self-destructive rage, but something colder. Something that could be learned from. History remembers Dracula. It makes movies about him, writes novels, builds tourist industries around castles he barely visited. The name has become synonymous with evil, with vampires, with the gothic horror that Western imagination needs to project onto Eastern Europe. Stephen the Great lies in a monastery at Putna, in a marble tomb that visitors walk past on their way to more famous attractions. The frescoes he commissioned are crumbling. The fortresses he built are ruins. The country he saved was swallowed by empires and re-emerged centuries later, changed beyond anything he would recognise. He won 47 battles. He held an empire at bay for half a century. He burned his own country to save it and watched his people die for a victory that would be undone by his grandchildren. The chroniclers called him Cel Mare, the Great. They meant it as praise. They didn't understand that greatness in his case was simply another word for endurance, for doing what had to be done, again and again, until the body finally broke and the will finally faded, and the long war ended the only way it could. Stephen died in bed, rotting from within. The empire he had held back endured for 4 more centuries. The men who followed him made the peace he had refused. And the name that made sultans hesitate became a footnote in the histories that celebrated flashier monsters. The grave at Putna is quiet now. Tourists come occasionally, mostly Romanians who remember what most of Europe has forgotten. They light candles, they say prayers, they take photographs of the marble slab that covers what remains of 47 years of war. They don't stay long. History remembers the spectacle. It forgets the survival. The stake made Vlad immortal. The fortress made Stephen a footnote. The empire endured. The man did not.